So, all right, so look, you have 4 phases, right? You have the menses. This is menstruation. This is like your period, whatever. What you're getting rid of is the endometrial lining. All right? You're getting rid of this endometrial lining that you have been building and preparing to receive a fertilized egg over the previous 3 weeks. But because progesterone and estrogen levels really, really, really plummet, that tells your uterus we do not have a fertilized egg. So we've got to get rid of this vascularization that we've been building over the previous 3 weeks, and we've got to start over. Okay? Now, why does the progesterone and estrogen levels fall? Because the corpus luteum degenerates. All right? Remember, the corpus luteum is what's formed from the follicle after ovulation. So it ovulates, it releases the egg, the zona pellucida, and what's left over becomes the corpus luteum. And it's secreting progesterone and estrogen. All right? So this all ties in together. Okay? This illustration in your book, it's also going to be on your PowerPoint. So if you look at it written out, you might want to write it a little bit. Can y'all see it, Tim? Okay, it might be less later. All right, so day 1 through 5. All right, menses, menstruation, period, whatever. Okay, you're eradicating the fully developed endometrial lining. And again, why have you been developing this? You've been developing this because every month your body has to prepare to receive a fertilized egg. Has to. Because your body doesn't know which month it's going to get pregnant, okay? And so it has to be prepared each time. So it's getting rid of the endometrial lining plus the unfertilized egg, which is about the size of a period at the end of a sentence in your textbook. And that's the secondary oocyte, right? Why does this happen? This occurs because you have a greatly decreasing estrogen and progesterone levels. These are the 2 main female hormones. Why do they fall? Because the corpus luteum is degenerating. Now, the thing about the menstrual cycle is like, before you know what's going on here, you have to kind of know what's going on previous. But because it's a cycle, you have to start somewhere. Okay? All right, so you're done with your period. Now, the thing about the days, the thing about the days is that it varies. It'll vary from month to month. It'll vary between one woman and another woman. It'll vary because maybe you're extremely active over the last several weeks. Maybe you're stressed. It can cause things to change. This is just average. I always get those comments, well, mine lasts longer. I'm like, I don't really care. So, but I'm just looking at average, okay? All right. So then we go to the proliferative phase, okay? Proliferative phase is around day 5 to 14. So you're looking at about 9, 10 days, something like that, okay? Here, LH and FSH starts affecting estrogen, and it starts having this positive feedback. Usually there's a negative feedback, but at this point, about halfway through the proliferative phase, there starts to be this positive feedback between LH, FSH, and estrogen. So LH and FSH will go up. That causes estrogen to go up, which causes LH and FSH to go up, and then back and forth and back and forth. Why is this happening? Okay. The reason it's happening is estrogen is helping to mature the follicle. It gets it triggered from moving from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle. And remember, the follicle parallels the oocyte. So as the primary oocyte moves to a secondary oocyte, okay, the follicle moves from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle. Okay, remember that doesn't happen unless it's going to ovulate. Now here's the tricky thing. The tricky thing is that estrogen actually causes up to a couple of dozen eggs to develop into a secondary oocyte. Do you release a couple of dozen in a month? Let's hope not, because that means you could potentially have 24 babies, which would not be very good. So what happens is almost always, you only release one egg. Those other secondary oocytes, those other secondary follicles, they stay back. They don't ovulate. they may ovulate later on. They might. Okay? They may ovulate the next month or the month after or whatever. Okay? But they're still involved in producing hormones. Okay? But it causes the follicle to mature. Okay? And it's leading to ovulation. Now, how this parallels labor is that you also have a positive feedback mechanisms that causes you to give birth. We'll talk about that later. There's this series of hormones, and sequence of hormones that's secreted as positive feedback, and it causes you to give birth. And once you give birth, it stops. It's kind of the same thing, except you're not giving birth to a baby, but you are kind of giving birth to an unfertilized egg. So it's kind of similar. It's one of those atypical circumstances where positive feedback is normal, and it doesn't lead to death. All right? Even though you might feel like it. I don't know. Now, what else is estrogen doing? It is initiating the endometrial lining, the thickening of the endometrial lining by increasing vascularization. Now, again, why does the endometrium want to increase in First of all, what does vascularization mean? What does it mean when it's becoming more vascular? More blood vessels. Okay? So why does the number of blood vessels have to increase?
More nutrients.
More nutrients and oxygen provided to who? The baby, if you get pregnant. If you get pregnant, right? All right, so this is kind of going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and then boom, ovulation takes place. Release the egg. Once that happens, that positive feedback mechanism between estrogen and LH and FSH, it kind of stops. All right? So, ovulation, secondary follicle ruptures, the follicle becomes a corpus luteum. All right? Remember, it's releasing the secondary oocyte. All right? And that's stuck in the middle of what process? Meiosis 2. Secondary, meiosis 2. Stuck in the middle of meiosis 2. All right? It's a product of meiosis 1, but it's stuck in the middle of meiosis 2. All right? Estrogen levels are going to fall. But now the second hormone, progesterone begins to rise. Okay? We'll go back and look at the picture in just a moment. Estrogen levels fall. Progesterone levels rise. All right? Why does progesterone levels begin to rise? All right, they really begin to rise in this fourth stage, the secretory phase. Secretory phase is 2 weeks. Your body has about 2 weeks to make a decision, are you pregnant or not? Okay? Do you know how much development happens in 2 weeks? If the egg is fertilized, around what time is it fertilized? Ovulation. It can't happen before ovulation, right? Because the egg got rid of during your period. So it has to happen during time of ovulation. So during that time, if it is fertilized here, during those 2 weeks, your unborn child has already passed the germinal stage and is already in the embryo stage. At that time, you're like, okay, I should start today. And you don't. And you're like, okay, maybe I'm just late. Maybe you wait another week. You're like, ooh, maybe I have a pregnancy test. By that time, your unborn child's his heart's already beating. 2 blood vessels side by side. Pulsating. Pushing blood throughout this little bitty thing. Right? Alright, so progesterone levels really, really start to go up at the beginning of secretory phase. And all the way. What is this causing? This is causing the endometrial lining to reach full development, full maturity, becoming fully vascularized. Again, so that it can provide a nurturing environment for that fertilized egg. Now, I keep saying a fertilized egg or zygote, but honestly, the zygote is not what's implanted in the endometrium. By the time it gets to the endometrial lining, it's like progressed past that. And it's already several cells. And we'll talk more about, prenatal development later. Okay? about halfway through, estrogen rises a little bit, not like it did in the proliferative phase, but it's going to rise a little bit, okay? And then at the very end, because it's like, okay, you're not pregnant, which just happens, 999 times out of 1,000. All right, you're not pregnant. The corpus luteum degenerates. All right, again, why does corpus luteum degenerate? We'll talk about that when we talk about this. But it degenerates, and since it's providing, at this point, most of the estrogen and progesterone, man, it plummets. And when it plummets, it's telling your uterus, okay, let's get rid of this. Let's start all over. Okay? The premenstrual cramps that you may feel, that's your uterus contracting. Why is it contracting? It's trying to push everything out. It's not too much unlike what happens when you give birth, except when you give birth, you're going from, here to way up here. I mean, it's just, it's kind of the same thing. Okay, so again, guys, look. Up here. Aaron, you missed some class. You better pay attention. All right. So, endometrial lining. It is being eradicated from the uterus because estrogen progesterone levels are low. Those levels are low, but the corpus luteum degenerated. All right, change that. Guys, FSH and LH stay pretty low. Once you get into the proliferative phase, about halfway in, is when FSH and LH start having a positive feedback with estrogen. That's initiating endometrial development. It's also leading to ovulation. See where ovulation takes place? Right after estrogen peaks. Estrogen's then going to fall. You get into secretory phase. That's when progesterone really starts to go up. Okay, estrogen has fallen, progesterone goes up, and that's what causes the endometrium to reach full development. Okay? And the corpus luteum will function for about 2 weeks, secreting progesterone and estrogen. Now, about a little more than halfway, estrogen starts to go up a little bit. All right? Now, come back over here. Brighten those lights a little bit, Kevin. Kevin, brighten those lights just a little bit. Or me. All right, here we go. So look, here's what's going on. This is what happens most of the time. All right? No pregnancy because there's no fertilization. No fertilization, that means no placenta forms in the 2 weeks between ovulation and when you're scheduled to start your period again. During those 2 weeks, there's no placenta that's forming. All right? If there's no placenta, this is the key hormone, HCG. Okay? HCG. Now, HCG is what, since there's no HCG, corpus luteum degenerates. HCG is what causes the corpus luteum to continue to function. There's no HCG, corpus luteum degenerates, estrogen progesterone levels fall, menstruation begins. That's what we just talked about. What if you do get pregnant? All right? That means fertilization has occurred around the time of ovulation. Zygote forms, and in those 2 weeks after ovulation, day 14 to 28, there's going to be a placenta that forms. It's going to be small. It's going to be only made up of a few cells, but it's going to form. Hold on just a second, Makai. Placenta is going to secrete HCG. HCG keeps the corpus luteum functioning. Because the corpus luteum continues to function, it secretes estrogen and progesterone, keeping them at higher levels. All right? Because the estrogen and progesterone levels are up, that's going to prevent menstruation from starting. You don't want to start menstruation because if you're pregnant, you want to hang on to that unborn child. And if you start menstruation, that's a miscarriage. Miscarriage is taking place. Okay? Kai, question. Not in the middle. Wait. Almost. Now, I want to tell you a story. I hope this makes sense. But I want to tell you a story. Yes?
Can you quickly just explain what's the difference
they're just two separate hormones that are both involved. Estrogen in this part of the menstrual cycle, it helps push it toward ovulation. It helps to initiate the development of endometrial lining, but it's really pushing it toward the follicle toward ovulation.
But I remember
Progesterone, its job is to mainly cause the endometrium to reach full development. Okay?
What was the thing that when they like one goes down and one goes up? Because I remember yesterday you said like estrogen went down or up.
Well, after ovulation, estrogen does go down, and progesterone starts to go up. But toward the end of the secretory phase, estrogen goes up a little. Okay? And that's where they should stay at if you are pregnant. But if you're not pregnant and you're no placenta, no HCG, corpus luteum degenerates and they both fall alive. Okay? Now, HCG, somebody asked me a question earlier, and I thought it was a pretty interesting question. They said, I've heard before if HCG shows up in a man that they have cancer. And I was like, what? I've never heard of that. So they looked it up, and apparently, I don't know if it's all cancer cells or some cancer cells produce HCG as a natural byproduct. Because HCG in no way should ever be in a man. But if it is, and if that's true about cancer cells, it's indicative that they may have cancer. It's also a good reason if a woman tests positive for pregnancy, why she does need to go to the doctor to do further tests to make sure she is pregnant. Because I've always wondered, I really have, I've always wondered, I can understand a false negative. I don't understand a false positive. But that would make sense. Because if a woman may have some cancer, all right, thinking she's pregnant and she's not, she has cancer, that could be indicative of a false positive. So that's why it's really important, if you were to test positive, go to the doctor. You need to go to the doctor anyway, but to have those further blood tests go. Because if you have cancer and it's producing HCG, other enzymes will be up from your liver. That would not be up if you're just pregnant. Okay? So here's a story I want to tell you. I was watching something a few years ago. Actually, it's probably been a lot more than a few years ago. But I was watching something a few years ago, and there was this woman, and it was this like show on Discovery Channel or Animal Planet or something like that. And there was this woman that was engaged. And she went to the doctor, and the reason she went to the doctor is because she went all the way through high school and all the way through college, and she never started her period. She never started her menstrual cycle. And she wanted to know what was going on because, she's going to get married. She's probably thinking about, okay, don't interrupt me. Because she was, her and her future husband would talk about having kids and stuff like that. And so she went to the doctor, and the doctor, they did ran some tests. She came back for the results. The doctor came in and didn't say a word. He just took his pen and wrote on a notepad 2 letters. And those 2 letters were... And what it turned out, externally, she was a female. She had a vagina. She had breasts. Genetically, she was a male. And the reason she didn't exhibit external male genitalia is because she lacked the receptors. You remember how enzymes and proteins, you have to have receptors to identify them, right? She lacked the receptors to receive the proteins produced by the genes in the Y chromosome. And so therefore, since she didn't have the receptors, she never developed in the womb into a boy. So genetically, she was male. Externally, she was female. Internally, she was non-sexual. She had no ovaries. She had no uterus. So it's like she had a hysterectomy. That's what a hysterectomy is. They take, the uterus and ovaries out. And you think about that, you're like, what do you do with that? I don't know. Honestly, she grew up as a female. I guess she felt female enough to get engaged to a man. I don't know what the man did. I don't know. I think it would be perfectly fine for the man to stay with her. You know, because externally it is her. Internal, I mean, genetically, you know, I don't know. What do you do with that? And that would be. She was born that way. I mean, you can't. You know, you think about. I mean, you can't help the way you're born, right? You can't help that. So, but I thought that was an interesting scenario. Not funny, but interesting.
That's confusing.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
I mean, or think about type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, you lose sensitivity to respond to insulin, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing. You just don't, you can't respond. Boys are boys because of the genes in a Y chromosome, okay? And those genes produce proteins. And your body responds to those proteins, and then you develop because of it. She just couldn't respond to the proteins produced by the genes in the Y chromosome. I mean, look at this. If somebody's this, is that possible? That's possible. That's that's Klinefelter syndrome.
Like all seen a movie about that.
Klinefelter syndrome, the person's male, but they're sterile, but they do exhibit some female secondary characteristics. There's also such thing as Turner syndrome,
I've heard that too.
which is this. When you only have an X chromosome, and it's a female, but they exhibit some male secondary characteristics. So,